Hey guys, my name is Michele. I'm a life coach and I'm dedicated to helping people to heal emotional wounds. Today I'm talking about something that happens when you've been in a long-term relationship with a malignant narcissist. And I want to talk about the need to stop pacifying toxic people. When I hear the word pacify, the first thing I think of is a baby, a small baby that is completely unable to emotionally regulate him or herself. That baby that is unable to emotionally regulate themselves, they need their caregiver, their parent, to help them. There's nothing wrong with pacifying an infant. In fact, if we don't, we are not loving people, right? That's normal. However, sometimes without realizing it, if we've been in a relationship with somebody that is a malignant narcissist, they are very similar to infants and toddlers who are unable to emotionally regulate themselves. They can't. They always need someone else to help them to emotionally regulate themselves or to pacify them, right? And without realizing it, it's a behavior that a lot of victims of emotional abuse fall into without even realizing it. In fact, most people that pacify toxic people do so with the best intentions. Their motive for pacifying the toxic person is to calm that person down, to seek peace, right? In a situation where peace is almost seemingly impossible to have, to avoid rage, to avoid pain. So their motive is coming from a good place, but it really is an unhealthy behavior, not only to the toxic person, but more importantly to yourself. So we're going to talk about that. And then I have 5 awesome tips to help you to stop this behavior if you're in a relationship with somebody. But even if you're not in a toxic relationship, this information can help you, because I know a lot of people watch my channel just to keep reminded of what emotional abuse and manipulation looks like so that they don't get sucked back into it. Well, if you're out of the relationship too, if you apply these 5 tips, it will help you to never find yourself in a relationship again with somebody that cannot emotionally regulate themselves. Okay, with that in mind, let's begin. The first thing I want to say is that when somebody is pacifying a toxic person, they're not always doing it on a conscious level. They're literally not saying in their head, okay, I am going to do this and that so as to emotionally regulate this person. No, it doesn't happen like that. What happens is they face situations on a daily basis. Sometimes those emotional abuse situations are overt. They're easily seen, but sometimes they're so covert that you don't even notice what's going on, but your brain is making changes. What it's doing is it's noticing what makes this person emotionally dysregulated. The sad thing is that what makes a toxic person emotionally dysregulated is anything that has to do with your autonomy, your passions, your love, your authentic self, including your own perspective on things. Let me give you some examples so that you understand what I'm saying. So let's say the toxic person does something that is rude. It happens all the time, right? They do something that's rude or hurts your feelings. And you bring that to their attention. You know, hey, that really hurt when you said this or that, or that really hurt my feelings when you act like this. Well, if you're dealing with a malignant narcissist, rather than self-reflecting and being like, you know, I didn't realize, I'm sorry, you know, I'll be more aware. Thank you for sharing your opinion. I don't want to hurt you. Rather than acting in a normal, healthy way, the malignant narcissist will turn it and attack with such force that what happens when that's done over a long period of time, you begin to associate bringing anything to their attention with rage, with pain, because maybe they punish you. They punish you with either their rage, they punish you with humiliation, they punish you with the silent treatment. And what often happens is the victim of malignant narcissism will often stop speaking up for themselves because it doesn't seem worth it. The toxic person never sees their side, never apologizes, only invalidates, further abuses, and then they suffer for weeks with the silent treatment. So they stop bringing up anything that the toxic person is doing that is hurting them. They are, in effect, pacifying the toxic person, right? They're saying, oh, if I do that, that makes them so mad, I'm not going to do it. Even though the motive is to protect themselves, by pacifying that person, what they're basically doing is relinquishing all control over their authentic, autonomous self. And the reason I say it's bad for the toxic person is because it feeds into their need for narcissistic supply. Essentially, you are giving the drug to the addict. Okay, they need that drug and you are giving it to them. I know the motive isn't to do something bad. I know the motive is for self-preservation and self-protection, and that makes sense. But what you're doing is you're feeding it. And so what happens when you begin to do that in small ways in the beginning of a relationship, that person that is now controlling you, right? Because everything you do is no longer about living your life. Everything you do becomes about, what can I do to make sure he or she isn't mad today? What can I do to make sure that they don't rage? Your whole life now revolves around making sure that that person stays emotionally regulated. When you begin to do that in small ways, when you begin to relinquish you to regulate them, it's what happens with the toxic person is the same thing that happens with any addict. They build a tolerance to the drug, right? So now they need more in order to get the same high. Well, it's the same thing with the toxic person. Maybe it was in little ways that they had you relinquishing you to regulate them, but with time, it grows into every aspect of your life. For example, if you have a passion, something that you do that makes you happy, eventually they will want the high of having the power to have you forego, give up, reject, and lose the loves that you had. So I remember one face-to-face client I had of mine, she's like, Michele, I used to love to read. Like, I loved to read. But whenever I would read, he would always, sometimes just small things he would do that he would say that would make me feel bad. Like he would say, oh, I can't believe you're wasting your time, or shouldn't you be doing this or that? All you do is read. Whatever it was, sometimes the control isn't about yelling and screaming and name calling. It's the consistent little negative jabs that plant in the victim's mind that they're doing something bad. They're doing something negative. And so what happens is they stop doing it. I remember that particular client told me, she said, and then once I stopped reading, he was reading all the time and criticizing me for not reading anymore, for giving up such an awesome hobby. So the truth is that when they are trying to control you, you think that you're pacifying them, you're giving up your passions, your loves, your authenticity, you're giving it up to make them happy. But the truth is, and I hope you can see that with that example, it's not about them needing to be happy. He wasn't happier because she stopped reading. He was just happy that he had the power to get her to stop. And then he had the power to make her feel bad about it and try to start again. It was all about control. That control is what made him happy. So the victim thinks that I'm going to pacify, I'm going to give up, I'm going to do whatever is needed so that they're not angry to make this person happy. But the other person isn't looking for you to make them happy. The other person, the malignant narcissist, is just looking for where in your life they can take more and more or exercise more and more control. And then remember, I said that the victim is doing this because they think it's a positive thing, right? They think that they are being a peace seeker. However, they are doing so at a very high cost. And the cost is their own authenticity, their own autonomous self. And that's why so many victims of narcissistic abuse, after the relationship ends, whether they're discarded or they discard, they have no idea who they are anymore. Because for so long, they weren't being themselves. They were like literal pacifiers. They were literally living their life. And when I say they, I include me in that, okay? So there's no judgment there. It happens. It's all due to psychological abuse. They're living their life to pacify, to emotionally regulate somebody that needs to be emotionally regulated in the most unhealthy ways possible. So now that you understand what's been going on, I'm going to give you 5 tips to help you if you're in the relationship. And if you're not in the relationship, these 5 tips can still help you. Because if you put these tips into practice, you're not going to get sucked back into another toxic relationship. Okay? The first tip is to recognize that you do not need them to agree with you in order for you to hold on to your perspective. Now that sounds super simple, super easy, but I'm not going to lie. When I learned that tip and I was with somebody that I felt was a toxic, malignant, psychologically abusive person, I was told that. I was told, Michele, you don't need that person to agree with you in order for you to hold on to your own perspective. However, I want to explain why this isn't easy, okay? If you've been with somebody for a long time and every time you give your perspective, right? Here's your perspective and here's the other person's perspective. And I have this conversation with so many of my face-to-face clients, but here's your perspective, here's their perspective. Every time you try to show them how you see it, they deny it, they invalidate it over and over and over again until eventually you begin to think that unless they agree with you, you can't have your perspective. So when people learn this, they're like, oh, okay, that sounds really good. But every time they try to put it into practice, something comes up inside. And that's because the person in your life, the toxic person, has conditioned you to think that you need their perspective. So in order to really start believing this tip, you have to start really thinking about it all the time, really analyzing the truth to it, noticing how normal it is in life to have 2 perspectives, right? Everyone's allowed to have their own perspective. And here's a way for you to be able to tell how much you believe this, okay? So let's use the example of reading since I brought it up earlier. Let's say you love reading, right? And you're reading a book and you're having a good time. You feel so good and you know that there's absolutely no guilt needed for you to take a few minutes out of your day to give something to you, right? You're always giving to others and you're allowed to give to yourself. You know that. The toxic person comes by and says, you never do anything. Okay. Here's how to tell if you have a hard time recognizing their 2 perspectives. If you suddenly feel the need to explain, to justify, to provide proof that you have every right to do that, then there's a big possibility that you have been programmed, conditioned, and trained to think that you need their perspective. However, when you really believe that you do not need them to agree with you, you'll notice them being nasty. You'll notice them being rude. You'll notice them not supporting anything that has to do with you. You'll notice it. You won't like it because who does, right? But you'll be able to say in your mind, well, that's their opinion. He's allowed to, or she's allowed to not like that I do this, but I'm still allowed to enjoy it. She or he's allowed to have negative energy. I'm still allowed to read my book and feel my own inner peace and happiness. But if you notice that that's hard for you, start saying it in your own mind all the time. Start thinking about all the times when you have examples where you were over-explaining and replay them in your mind by saying, you know what? They're allowed to have their opinion. I'm allowed to feel this way. I'm allowed to enjoy this. I'm allowed to be happy. They're allowed to be angry. I'm allowed to be happy. The more you can do it in your own mind, the easier it will be when a circumstance comes up that calls for you to be able to do that. Once you master that, the next tip is to respond instead of react. So, using the book example, if the malignant narcissist says, you'd never do anything, you're just wasting your time all the time, all I have is a person that reads, that's not a spouse, that's pathetic, whatever they say, if you've recognized that first tip, you let go of the need to have them see your perspective, right? You let go of that need and you can now respond. You can say, well, sorry you feel that way. Well, you're allowed to feel that way. Thanks for sharing your opinion. And if they push and push and push that you have to do something, you can just continue using the broken record. I'll finish in 15 minutes. I'll finish in 15 minutes. If they continue on, block them out. And again, all of these tips are for people that are not in physically dangerous situations, but in emotionally abusive situations. The reason I say that is because if your life is in danger, then these are not the tips that you should be, listening to. You need to be looking for ways to get yourself safe. Okay, so that's the second tip. Respond without reacting. The first step is about recognizing that you're allowed to have your own perspective, right? In order to respond, you also need to recognize that they're allowed to have their perspective too. They're allowed to be nasty. They're allowed to be negative. I mean, no one likes it, but just like you don't want them to control you, you have to let go of wanting them to change as well. The only person you can focus change on is yourself. Tip number 3 is to get back to you. I can't tell you how many times in my face-to-face coaching, I'll ask somebody, well, who are you? Like, what do you like? If you were to stop living your life today thinking, oh, I have to do everything to make sure that that person's not angry. And if you were to actually stop and let go of that, what would you be doing? And I can't tell you how many blank expressions I get back. People have for so long been pacifying the toxic person, they don't even know who they are anymore. They don't even know what their passions are. They don't even know what they like to do. So if that's your case, start finding you. Make it a journey. Have curiosity about who you really are, who your authentic self is. Start finding it. And one of the most powerful ways to start finding it is to just check in with yourself. Just ask yourself, if I were to be my authentic self today, what would I like to do? What's one small thing that would make me happy today that I would like to do? Start asking yourself. Now, this is a challenge because the way we think, what happens in our brain is the way we think frequently is like a well-worn path in our mind, right? And that well-worn path in your mind is probably, what can I do to make him or her happy? What does he or she need? And your focus has so been on that other person that the path to you is like overgrown. Think of like a highway and a jungle pathway where nobody's ever walked down. That's what the path to you looks like. So yes, it takes effort. It's like taking a machete to the jungle and carving a pathway. It takes effort to help your mind to start thinking about you. It's not going to happen automatically. But the more you ask yourself, the more you check in with yourself, the more connected you are to yourself. Each time you ask yourself, what would I like? What's important to me? What would make me happy? How am I feeling? What do I need right now so that I can be happy? The more you're asking yourself these questions and reflecting and then giving yourself what you need, you're carving a new path. And the last tip. Is start giving yourself what you have been chasing the toxic person to give you. Okay, so what does that mean? If you've been dying for the toxic person to see your value, right? Now you've lived your whole life trying to get them to see your value as a spouse. Start noticing your value. See, the thing is, they have you convinced that you need them to see it in order for you to hold on to your perspective. Kind of like point number 1 that we talked about. That's a lie. You just have to start teaching yourself to see your own perspective and value it. So make a list of everything you've done that makes you a good spouse and start validating it. Make a list of everything you've done that, and I know the list can be easy to make, because if you think of everything you've done that they never noticed, that's where you start your list, okay? And then once you get that list down, start giving yourself credit. Start seeing your value. If you've been dying for them to compliment you, to say nice things to yourself, ask yourself, how many nice things do you say to you? If you realize that you have literally stopped noticing anything good about you and you've been waiting for them to see it and say it, then start changing that. Start using your inner dialogue to generate self-love, self-worth, and self-compassion. How many nice things do you say to yourself on a daily basis? If you're not saying anything to yourself except negative things and waiting for the toxic person to say something nice, you're setting yourself up for failure and misery. Start giving yourself what you've been dying for them to give you. If you have been dying for them to care and cherish you, right? Ask yourself, what do you do to care and cherish you? How are your self-care habits? Are you giving yourself that self-care? We tend to think that somebody external needs to fill these holes within us. But the truth is that when you start generating these things from within, you start healing your past wounds, you start healing your present wounds, and you start empowering yourself